Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to discuss the Korean War. But before we begin our lecture proper for today, I'd just like to do our customary recap and just touch bases slightly on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture we looked at the beginning of the Cold War, and in particular we looked at the Marshall Plan, the presidency of Harry Truman, and of course the emergence of nuclear weapons on the global stage. Now, Harry Truman, of course, succeeded Franklin Roosevelt. He was sort of the accidental president. Roosevelt died weeks after being inaugurated, and Truman sort of inherited his presidency. Much the same way Theodore Roosevelt inherited the presidency of William McKinley after McKinley's assassination. Truman would, immediately upon taking office, he would be stiff-armed by the realization that because he was not a very close confidant or even a close advisor of Franklin Roosevelt, he was completely in the dark regarding the the Manhattan Program and the fact that the United States had access to nuclear weapons. So Truman was immediately faced with the difficult task of whether to use these weapons. From past lectures, we now know that he did decide to use these weapons in war to bring the Japanese to heel, using them at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. After that, Truman presidency was marked by the integration of the United States military, and of course the early stages, the early break in the unity between the Allied powers of the Soviet Union and the United States. Truman's presidency also saw the emergence of the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan was an economic recovery plan conceived of and presented by then sitting Secretary of State George Marshall. Marshall's plan called for large sums of money to be allocated to the powers of Western Europe so that they could revitalize their economies, and that they would be able to sort of drift into, well, not even drift, but really be pulled into the orbit of the United States. The Marshall Plan had the effect of at once converting Germany from an adversary into an ally. It enabled the German economy to recover, making Germany at once a trade partner for the United States, and it at once had the great impact of helping to spread democracy in Germany and to heal the rifts that existed between Germany and the United States from 1919. There was still a segment of the German population that blamed the United States for the Treaty of Versailles, because the Germans in 1919 had only agreed to the armistice based on the strengths and the fact that the 14 points that Wilson and the Inquiry had drafted and created, that they came to the peace table with the understanding that those 14 points would be the basis of a European peace. And of course, nuclear weapons. The entire situation with the Cold War from 1946 until 1989 was largely dominated by the fact that both superpowers who were antagonistic towards each other, the United States and the Soviet Union, that they both possessed weapons of mass destruction. They both possessed weapons that mutually assured the destruction of the other should nuclear war occur. And it served as a great deterrent to war. Both powers would go to war during the time period, not against each other, but just to war in general. And at no point did they ever use those weapons against the foes they were fighting or against each other. And with that being said, let's dive right into our lecture for today. So with the successful testing of their atomic bomb, a great panic went off. With the successful testing of the Soviet atomic bomb, a great panic went off within the United States. The Truman administration began to question the loyalty outright of many federal employees as they sought answers for understanding how and why the Soviets were able to gain access to atomic weapon technology and understanding. Notwithstanding the fact that the Germans were also working on atomic bombs, and that the Soviet had access to a large number of German scientists who were working on that bomb in and around Berlin. And those scientists were then co-opted into Soviet service to continue Soviet technological progress. Now, in the panic that ensued during what we now recognize as the Second Red Scare, Joseph McCarthy capitalized on the irrationality of his fellow Americans, and he led a domestic terror campaign. Now, while this was going on, the United States was embroiled in a major international struggle in Korea that would prove influential on future diplomatic relations. The Korean War itself originated in the Soviet-American division of the Korean Peninsula, which really suited the two superpowers, but not the Korean peoples themselves. Has stated in the last two lectures, former General Dwight D. Eisenhower ran successfully for president in 1952. He succeeded in 1953. Harry Truman as president of the United States, and upon taking office, he arranged a ceasefire in Korea in 1953. And for the remainder of the Cold War, Korea and Berlin would serve, and again, going back to Berlin and the division of Berlin, the Berlin Airlifts, those two places would serve as flashpoints for the Soviets and the Americans. Now, the end of the fighting and Joseph McCarthy's rash attacks on senior army commanders brought his particular reign of terror to an end. And now the world rapidly changed in the 1940s, has a sense that espionage had undermined the security of the United States. The Soviet Union completed its atom bomb much sooner than the United States had anticipated or expected. And leaders in the United States concluded that espionage and espionage alone was the only logical conclusion to be drawn from that. It was discovered by American investigators that a spy ring had been operating at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Two members of the spy ring were charged with treason, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were eventually executed for the crime of treason. Now, the other significant event of 1949 was the Chinese Revolution. And really, China was in a quagmire long before that, and revolution is a sort of lofty name to give it. But the defeat of Chiang Kai-Shek, who was backed by the United States, and going back to the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt had wrangled from Stalin official diplomatic recognition and backing for Kai-Shek against the communist leader Mao Zedong. But this event, the defeat of Chiang Kai-Shek and the ascendancy of Mao Zedong, intensified internal fears over communism in the United States. And within the United States itself, since the turn of the century, they viewed China as American, as a portion of that American informal overseas empire. China was viewed as an American ward, so to speak, a protectorate. Looking back to the war with the Japanese, defeating the Japanese gave and many in America open rights. It confirmed America's domination of China, and it confirmed that America and America alone had the rights of exploitation of China and Chinese resources. The loss of China was a very devastating blow to the United States, and Americans of the day, Americans of the 1950s and of 1949, they spoke of how events at home contributed to the loss of China. Now, the situation within China itself had been very stressed for a long time. As many people know, China was a long-time monarchy, going back into, but before the common counting of time, before the Common Era, China had been a monarchy. And in one of the first lectures that I did, very first lectures that I did, I sort of outlined the reign and the career of Qin Shi Huang, which literally means the first emperor of Qin. Since his reign, China has largely been under the control of one imperial dynasty after another, following the Mandate of Heaven laws, which all succeeding dynasties used to justify their rebellion or their takeover of the imperial throne. But the Chinese monarchy came to an end in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, sorry. And China had really lost the ability to project outward power and suffered a collapse, a string of collapses during the 19th century, as European powers and the United States sort of carved out zones for themselves, their own little spheres of influence. In the early 20th century, the ancient monarchy collapsed and was followed by rival leaders backed by armies of their own, fighting it out during the 1910s to replace the dethroned emperor. And during the 1920s, Chiang Kai-Shek and Mao Zedong emerged as the preeminent leaders of this chief rival factions. Their rivalry was put on hold. Has the Chinese people sort of united to contest the Japanese, who had invaded Manchuria in the 1930s, but resumed as soon as the Japanese threat was neutralized in the 1940s. Now, the United States was providing aid to Chiang Kai-shek on a massive scale, but its regime was corrupt, and its armies faced larger numbers of defections because of that, because of his policies. And it became clear to all in China and abroad that Chiang was going to be defeated. To the American anti-communist, it appeared that the stain of communism was spreading across the world. First through the massive Russian Empire, then Eastern Europe, and now it's in China. It appeared that communism was this unstoppable force, and that disloyal Americans could help spread communism here in the United States. Now, Chiang Kai-shek retreated to the island of Formosa, also known as Taiwan. With the aid of the United States Navy, Chiang's defeat led anti-communist Republicans in Congress to denounce President Truman as soft on communism, contributing to the loss of China. Truman's softness contributed to the Americans losing their ward. That was the rhetoric of Republicans in Congress during the early 1950s. Now, the Truman administration was at the moment investigating federal employees. Truman himself began the practice of background checking federal employees in 1947, trying to see if they had any sort of communist affiliation. The Rosenberg trial was attention-grabbing, but was in no way really more threatening than the Alger Hiss trial, which intimated that communist or communist sympathizers had infiltrated high civilian offices. Hiss was a former senior New Dealer, and he was now the head of the Carnegie Endowment. He was, I should say, the head of the Carnegie Endowment, and a personal friend of Dean Acheson. And Acheson was the sitting Secretary of State for Truman. Hiss was accused by Whittaker Chambers, a former Soviet courier who was now a leading anti-communist. He was accusing Hiss. Whittaker Chambers was accusing Alger Hiss of spying and passing on sensitive information to the Soviet Union, to their leadership. Hiss denied it all, stating that he had never been a spy or met with Chambers. And Hiss was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and the second trial resulted in a perjury conviction. Everybody was convinced that he was lying, and that at the first trial it was simply one that they had run out of the statute of limitations, and two, that the jury had that the case had just been fumbled and presented awkwardly to the jury. But everyone was convinced that he was lying, and it was convicted of perjury. They were convinced that he had just lied about his affiliation, about being a Soviet spy. But he avoided treason charges because of the statute of limitation, because of that run out. Now his convictions rested on the strength of Chambers' knowledge of the intimate details of his life, which was very uncanny. I mean, he had information that only a personal companion of his during the 1930s could know. Chambers knew minute, intimate details of his private life going all the way back to the 1930s, which satisfied the jury that Hiss had in fact been a spy for the Soviet Union. Now, Hiss continued to deny Chambers' claim and enjoyed the support of liberal politicians until the 1970s, when Alan Weinstein released a very comprehensive book about the subject called Perjury. Now, during the 1930s, while the Great Depression was raging, the American Communist Party had enjoyed a great surge in popularity among Americans of all intellectual background, but particularly in the American intellectual community, many of whom, some 20 years later, were now senior members of the American civil bureaucracy. It is important to remember that capitalism had failed in the minds of millions and millions of people. Has the stock market crashed and the ravages of the Depression set in, many felt that communism seemed like a rational plan for any nation, and in particular for the United States. With its ideas of regulating anti-competition to spur the economy, with this idea and a practice of eliminating the business cycle, it seemed plausible until World War II and the mobilization that brought the United States economy out of the Depression. Most look back on their involvement with the Communist Party as youthful indiscretion. They look back on it and they didn't think much of it. Many didn't even mention it again. Now, another reason for the eclipsing of communist prestige were the purges that Stalin ordered against the Russian peasantry, the Soviet army, the original Bolsheviks, and of course his purges of his enemies in the Soviet satellite states. For former members of the Communist Party, when they were confronted or admitted to being members, when they were confronted with accusations, or whenever they did admit to being members of the Communist Party, they were normally asked to name who else was in their little communist group, who else was in their communist cell. They were asked to give names and really very detailed listings, including phone numbers and addresses of everybody else in their group. There was a condition of the government exonerating those who gave information to the committee that investigated communism. But many people drew the line at that. Many people refused to name their accomplices or in any way implicate others in communist activities. And as a result, they lost their jobs for their obstinacy, while others simply resigned and simply melted away into the background. But there was a price to pay for that. The United States House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities investigated suspected communists. Richard Nixon, his political career springboarded because of this committee. He sat on this committee and his career springboarded because of it. And he earned the reputation, and throughout his career he would carry this designation as being a hardliner on the Cold War and a hardliner as far as communism was was concerned. And at the time, Nixon was a freshman congressman. He had joined Congress, and he had been elected to Congress in 1946. And by 1950, he had gained enough renown to gain to gain sponsorship, to gain election into the Senate. And by 1952, he was tapped to be Dwight D. Eisenhower's running mate for president. So it's the being hard on communism and being a Cold War hardliner has certainly benefited Dick Nixon. Within 4 years of being in the House, he had enough clout to make it to the Senate, and after 2 years in the Senate, he had enough clout to be the Vice President of the United States. So Nixon's early career sort of highlighted the sort of reward that went hand in hand with being a hardliner as far as communism is concerned. Now, the Korean War intensified the fears about communism. In the United States, the containment policy was really tested when Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, he had been the leader, the communist leader of North Korea, and he invaded South Korea in June of 1950. Now, Korea was a former Japanese conquest. The Japanese had literally began their invasions, began building their empire in the early 20th century. As the European powers fought it out in World War I, the Japanese were fighting it out in Korea during the same time. It had been liberated and partitioned by the Soviets and the Americans. And after World War II, the expectation was that the peninsula will once again be reunited, and new elections will be held to put a new government in place. Now, the plan hit difficulty as both the United States and Soviet Union put conflicting and contrasting democratic and communist governments in place, and these governments were just antagonistic towards each other. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, inadvertently provided the motivation for North Korea to invade South Korea. Once Kim Il-sung invaded, the United States responded by vowing to support Syngman Rhee, who was the Democratic leader in South Korea. They vowed to help Rhee with against the communist leader, this communist invasion. Now, during and after the conflict in Korea, American policies contemplated the actions of the British and the French leadership during the 1930s and their appeasement of Adolf Hitler. American policymakers were determined not to repeat the mistakes, and these are mistakes in their eyes that were made by the British and the French policymakers. They were determined not to repeat the mistakes made to the Nazis with the communists. Their policy was to fight the enemy while he was weak and far away, rather than appease him and allow him to get stronger and allow him to edge closer and closer to home. At the same time, things were looking bleak in Korea. The Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations over its refusal to seat the incoming member from Communist China. The United States took advantage of that moment to gain the upper hand in the United Nations and to gain approval for a resolution condemning the invasion of South Korea and approving military action. Now, the United Nations approved the campaign, but it was an American action from the beginning until the end. And with that, we will break here, and we will come back with part 2 of our lecture on the Korean War. And as always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this, our first lecture detailing the events of the Korean War.